Neanderthals?
10 minutes. It's all yours.
Okay. Okay, good morning, everyone. You may or may not know that every single person in this room is about 3% Neanderthal. Today I want to introduce to you what we know about these Neanderthals, how we know that, and what implications it has for thinking about being human. A good place to start is in 1856, when one June day, some quarry workers in the Neander Valley, or in German, Neanderthal, discovered a series of very interesting fossils, some of them shown here. And right from their discovery, these attracted very diverse interpretations. So some descriptions noted unusual features, so particularly the what's called the brow ridge, or the supraorbital torus, a kind of bony protrusion above the eyes. You don't find this sort of feature in us, in Homo sapiens. So this is a modern Homo sapiens, this is a Neanderthal, and you can see this pronounced bony mass. So some people said this is a different kind of human, what we would today call a different hominin species. Others contested this view, though. Some people said, there's no way, we know there's one kind of human, this is something like a Russian Cossack. So one prominent German anatomist said this was a Cossack who'd been injured in the Napoleonic Wars, he'd been in pain, frowning, and this had made these sort of bones appear. But all the way through to the present day, how we think about Neanderthals has had these sort of polarized debates. Across the 19th century and all the way through until today, more and more discoveries have been made. So fossils, archaeology, genetics. And it's now clear that the Neanderthals are a distinct form of human, a hominin group or species or population. I'll come back to the terminology in a minute. Spatially, they occurred in Western Eurasia in time between about 400,000 years ago and about 40,000 years ago. Neanderthals are very similar to us, perhaps slightly shorter on average, a bit stockier. They actually have a slightly larger brain and a suite of distinctive anatomical features. I'm not going to talk particularly about culture today, but the point is the idea of Neanderthals as a kind of brutish, caveman has really been falsified. Neanderthals have had very sophisticated technology and sort of symbolic culture and so on. So when it became generally accepted among researchers that the Neanderthals were a real thing, ever since there's been a sort of debate about how we classify and characterize Neanderthals. So the classic view was that Neanderthals were the ancestors of us. So you get this kind of classic sort of progressivist march of progress, it's called, this very simplistic view where there's a single kind of evolutionary path. But in the 20th century, lots and lots more discoveries were made, and the hominin family tree became much bushier. So, for example, you may have heard of Lucy. This is the cast. She's an Australopithecus afarensis, so about 3.5 million years old, somewhere in here. And in the case of Neanderthals, the general view has become that our species evolved in Africa, and that Neanderthals are not our ancestor, but they're a cousin, a side branch, as shown here. So we have a common ancestor, we evolved in Africa, Neanderthals evolved in Western Eurasia. And from this, Neanderthals came to play the role of a kind of failed human, a kind of alternative path of being human that wasn't quite good enough because they were, brutish or a bit simplistic. This was the view until 2010, when this kind of bombshell paper was published in the journal Science, which used kind of emerging technology of ancient DNA analysis and found that actually all non-African people are 2 to 4% Neanderthal in terms of DNA, right? So the idea is our species evolved in Africa, but as we began to spread around the world, there was some kind of population mixture with Neanderthals, and that was sort of carried around the world. And this is not merely of abstract interest. This is very much kind of ongoing science, but a suite of medical and so on aspects relate to our kind of differential Neanderthal inheritance, so for good and bad. And this has triggered a very sort of interesting debate about how we classify Neanderthals. Because on the one hand, you could argue that given the fact that we all have Neanderthal DNA, that Neanderthals are therefore not a different species to us. This comes to how we understand species. So there are many what are called species concepts. The most familiar is what's called the biological species concept. This is basically the idea that a species refers to individuals who can breed and produce fertile offspring, right? So a lion and a tiger can't produce fertile offspring. And yeah, we exist, so clearly Neanderthals and sapiens did produce fertile offspring. The plot thickens, though. If you look at the genetics of the earliest Homo sapiens in Europe, so spreading from Africa about 45,000 years ago, these people had much, much more Neanderthal DNA than we have. So we're about 3%. If you go back 45,000 years, they're about 10%. So in other words, there's been a very strong selection against this introgressed Neanderthal DNA. And if you look at our genome, there's very variable Neanderthal contribution. So for example, the X chromosome, the sex chromosome, is essentially devoid of Neanderthal DNA. So there's a very interesting process of selective pressure, right? So it's not agreed at the moment whether Neanderthals were a separate species or a population, and to me this is the beauty of the subject, that there's a kind of empirical foundation, but then a lot of what you could almost call philosophy about how we sort of interpret these results. So, to wrap up, I think we can say that the Neanderthals existed. They exist in space and time with particular features. And there was a process of speciation. So Neanderthals and Homo sapiens were separating, but then a kind of unusual thing happened. Our species rapidly spread around the world and kind of interrupted the speciation process. But this is a really, I think, useful window into how we define species, how we think about, extinction and so on. So, thank you very much.
Thank you, Hugh. That was extremely interesting. So, hey, say hi to your you managed to go through the whole of recent human history